Welcome back, everyone. For our last session of the day, we're going to take a look at industry trends of public employee pension systems around the country. Here to represent us is our legislative team led by Brad Pacheco, the Deputy Executive Officer for Communications and Stakeholder Relations, along with two guests from NASRA. Before I turn it over to Brad, I've been asked by Mr. Juarez to afford him a moment of personal privilege.
Yeah, thank you for that personal privilege. I appreciate that. I just wanted to say to the board that I have a personal relation, and I mean that in a professional sense, with one of our panelists. I was there when Janine started her career in California, and I can speak to her training, and I've sort of monitored her progress over what's been about 25 years now, incredibly. But just wanted to say something because I do need to step out at 5 to 4, but wanted to again express my happiness in seeing that she was on the panel, and I think you'll be impressed with both her and what Keith have to say. So I just wanted to make sure I was able to say that before I had to leave.
Thank you very much, Mr. Juarez. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to you, Brad, for introductions.
Great. Thank you, Madam President. And I know we are the last show of the day, so I just ask for your attention for the next hour. Our special guests have traveled quite far and endured the elements to be here. So we are joined by two well-known national pension experts from the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, and I'd like to introduce them and just briefly preview what you can expect to hear about retirement activity at the federal level and current trends in pensions across our nation. Janine Marco Raymond has been the Director of Federal Relations for NASRA for more than 16 years. She advocates for the interest of NASRA members, including CalPERS, before Congress, the administration, and many federal agencies. And Janine also serves as the advisory board, or on the advisory board of the Wharton Business School's Pension Research Council, the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans Government Liaison Committee, and on the board of directors for the Coalition to Preserve Retirement Security. And joining Janine is Keith Brainerd, who is the research director for NASRA, and he is responsible for the news and the studies and the reports, many of which we receive and are often serve as the foundation for policy discussions on pensions and retirement security. And Keith is the creator of the Public Funds Survey. I know many of you have seen that. It's an online compendium of public pension data developed and maintained through a collaboration between the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, the Center for State and Local Government Excellence, and NASRA. And both Janine and Keith are often called to speak before Congress, legislative committees, and the media in their role. So I know we've talked about this a little bit today, how the landscape in Washington has changed dramatically under the new administration. Janine's going to cover some of the key issues that NASRA has been active on, as well as discuss how the shift at the federal level has placed a greater focus on defending current laws and regulations as opposed less on advocating for change. But first we're going to turn to Keith. He'll start our discussion by teeing up some of the factors that are driving change in public pensions across our nation and some of the underlying research that's influencing that change. So I want to thank them both for being here, and I'll turn the floor over to Keith.
Thank you, Brad. Madam President, members of the board, feel free to stop me if you'd like and ask questions along the way, or we'll be happy to answer questions anytime or at the end as well. So what I've tried to do is assemble a handful of slides that are intended to present the major issues that are prevailing in the public pension community and the way this community really has been changing in a macro sense, especially over the last 10 or 15 years. I identified 5 factors that are driving 5 changes, not necessarily correlated, but you can read these as well as I can. These major factors, of course, the subpar investment returns, and we'll look at most of these in detail in the ensuing slides. And many of these, if not all of these, are not new to you. I don't believe anybody expected interest rates to go so low or to stay so low so long, but this is where we are. The public sector workforce is much more mature now and continues to become more mature. And in this context, maturity means there are more people who are retired and receiving a benefit from these plans, and relatively fewer who are participating and contributing to these plans, which has, of course, an actuarial impact. And of course, plan sponsors, states, cities, school districts, everyone has been constrained, particularly since the Great Recession, 07 to 10. And some of the key outcomes emanating from some of these factors, of course, higher unfunded pension liabilities and all else equal. A higher unfunded liability means costs are higher. Costs are certainly not higher because benefits have been increased. In fact, the opposite is true. Particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, public pension plans have been using more conservative actuarial methods and assumptions, investment return assumptions, methods for amortizing unfunded liabilities, and others. There's been a lot of reforms enacted around the country, and in almost every case, those reforms have taken the form of either higher employee contributions or lower benefits, in many cases both. And in general, there's been a broad shift of risk that has traditionally been borne by employers and now is being increasingly shared by the plan participants, the employees. So before we get into some of the details, 50,000-foot view of the retirement benefit structure in the United States. If you do the math between employers who do not sponsor a retirement benefit and employees who elect to not participate in their employer-sponsored retirement benefit, slightly less than 1/2 of the private sector workforce is participating in an employer-sponsored retirement benefit at all. I find that to be a very unsettling, sobering statistic. This nation, I think, faces a retirement crisis, and non-participation has much to do with that on the side of the private sector. Pension coverage, defined benefit plans continue to go away. Most of those that remain are closed to new members. Many of those have been frozen. And so we can expect to see a continuation of the decline in defined benefit coverage in the private sector. Fortunately, Social Security coverage is universal for all intents and purposes in the private sector. Unfortunately, Social Security faces its own long-term issues, and certainly within the next 15 years or so, Social Security is going to need to be fundamentally reformed as well. On the public sector side, and this does not include federal employees, this is employees of state and local government, retirement coverage by employers is pretty much universal. Somewhere north of 99% of employees of state and local government have access and participate in an employer-sponsored retirement plan. In most cases, almost 90% of those cases, employees are participating in a pension plan, such as the one that CalPERS administers. Social Security coverage is not universal, though, as you know. Roughly 25–30% of employees of state and local government do not participate in Social Security. That includes 40% of public school teachers are not in Social Security, including those in California. Also, a majority of firefighters and police officers are outside of Social Security. So one of the factors that I indicated there a moment ago was the subpar investment returns. The chart shown on the slide right now reflects median midpoint returns from a database that's maintained by Callan Associates, a national investment consulting firm. And in particular, I would point out the 10 and 20-year returns that are well south of 7.5 or 8%. And until about, as we'll see in a little bit, until about less than 10 years ago, the median investment return assumption was 8%. It's come down in the last few years, but those investment returns in the median of about 5.5 or 6.8%. These are compounded figures, and so when you compound a shortfall like that over 10 or 20 years, that amounts to a lot of dollars that have been foregone, that are not available to pay down unfunded liabilities. This chart I know is no secret to you because I took this off of your website. And I'm sure that you have been exposed to this material before, and certainly is no secret that projected returns on various asset classes are lower today than they were before. There's nothing magical about 10 years. In fact, as you know, public pension plans tend to look out 20 to 30 years in terms of their investment horizon, but the overarching point, of course, is that it's not reasonable to expect to generate an investment return in the future, such as that we've been experiencing over the last 20 or 30 years. The demographic composition of the public pension community is also an important factor, and one that is undergoing significant change. And this chart is plotting the relative change in employment for employees of state and local government and the private sector. And focusing on the red line there, those are state employees. And the fact that the red line is slightly below 100% means that right now there are fewer state employees in the United States today than there were 10 years ago, 11 years ago, in fact. You know, your actuaries will tell you that they are anticipating a certain amount of growth in employees and in payroll, and when plan sponsors are not able to hire, the pie is smaller and the denominator is smaller, and as a result, all else equal, the cost of the benefit as a percentage of payroll is going to be higher. And local government is only slightly better. There are only slightly more local government employees, which includes public school teachers, as there were 1 decade ago. This has to do with the maturing of the public pension community, and this chart, which reflects public fund survey data, the public fund survey is a universe of public pension data that reflects roughly 85% of the public pension community. So all the money in the people in the public pension community is reflected in these. And on this chart, the blue bars reflect the change from the prior year in the number of people who are receiving a regular benefit from these retirement systems, such as CalPERS and others. You can see a fairly consistent change from the prior year of 3.5 or 4%. The lighter colored bars there toward the bottom corroborate the graph we were looking at a moment ago, and that is the change from the previous year in the number of active members, the people who are contributing to these plans. And you can see we went through this sustained period of year-over-year reductions in the number of public employees who are participating in these plans. And this gets back to that actuarial fact that I was referring to a moment ago, where you're not generating the additional payroll that actuaries are anticipating. The line at the top of the chart indicates the number of actives for every annuitant, each person who's receiving a regular benefit from these retirement systems. And you can see there's a very steady trend there. At the beginning of the measurement period, back at the beginning of this century, there were about 2.4 active members for every person who was receiving a retirement benefit in this country. And as a result of these changes, the faster growth in the number of people who are receiving a regular benefit compared to the relatively slow growth of those who are active and contributing to these, we've seen this continuous, steady decline in the ratio of actives to annuitants. So on a relative basis, there's much more money going out of these systems than there was 15 years ago at the beginning of this measurement period. And this trend is not new. If you go back 20 or 30 years, back when this nation was much younger, particularly following the maturing of the baby boomer population as they were getting out of college, it was not unusual to see active annuitant ratios among retirement systems of 5, 6, 7 to 1. We were younger as a nation. A lot of people were coming out of college, relatively fewer people going into retirement, and that's really reversed. It's not necessarily a problem for a retirement system to have a declining ratio or even a low ratio. However, it can become a problem if you've got a relatively large unfunded liability, because if your active to annuitant ratio is relatively low, then you may not be generating the payroll that you need to amortize the unfunded liability. It makes it more difficult to sort of dig out of that unfunded liability hole. There are some retirement systems that have more annuitants than they have actives, and that is not necessarily a problem. It has to do with the funding condition of the plan. This ratio is at the heart of Social Security's long-term funding problems, but there's an important difference, and that is that Social Security operates largely on a pay-as-you-go basis, and so Social Security is using current revenues in order to pay current obligations. And as a result, Social Security is very sensitive to this ratio. And in fact, a few years ago, Social Security, just in the last 4 or 5 years, Social Security went cash flow negative, meaning that they began to pay out each year more in benefits than they're taking in each year in contributions. And so, as I mentioned at the outset in the discussion about Social Security, eventually these numbers will catch up with them, and they're going to have to make some changes in the benefit structure or the financing structure, or both. So again, this change in ratio is not necessarily a problem, but it can be a problem, particularly with respect to the unfunded liabilities of the plan. Similarly to the demographic changes have been the payroll changes. And what this chart is plotting is the annual change in the wages and salaries for the private sector and for employees of state and local government. and the government there is indicated by the red line. And you can see we went through about a 5-year period where the annual change for employees of state and local government was less than 1.5%, really hovering around 1% for a number of years. And again, this gets back to the payroll growth for these retirement systems, and when payroll is not growing, then the plan is not accumulating the dollars that are necessary or expected in order to pay down unfunded liabilities. Things certainly have improved in the last few years. This may be the new normal, something closer to 2%. Historical figures have been something closer to the on the order of 3 or 4%. I don't know if whether or not we'll get back there, and I suspect that based on other economic data, 2% may become the new normal. So for a public pension funding level to improve, the assets have to grow faster than the liabilities, really very, very simply stated. And what this chart is plotting is the annual change from the prior year in the median among the plans that we monitor, roughly 125 public pension plans, the change from the prior year in assets and liabilities. And in most years, you can see that the liabilities have grown faster, and that is why in most years the aggregate public pension funding level has declined for the public pension community as a whole, with certain exceptions. One thing that's worth pointing out, I think, though, is that the annual growth in liabilities has fundamentally changed. If you go back, at the beginning of this measurement period and previously, typical annual liability growth would be on the order of 6 to 9%. Why do public pension liabilities grow? Well, they grow as employees work and as they accumulate benefits for each year worked, as cost of living adjustments are provided, all of the elements that go into the cost of a benefit, that's part of the liability. And notice on this chart how the liability growth fundamentally changed about 8 years ago following the Great Recession. We saw a fundamental change in salary growth among employees of state and local government has been much lower than it has been traditionally. Far fewer benefit enhancements, fewer discretionary cost of living adjustments. Many of the things, the elements that go into driving liabilities was reduced. In fact, this liability growth figure would be lower still were it not for the plans reducing their investment return assumption. But all else equal, when you return the investment return assumption, that liability is going to be higher. But it has been an interesting change to see this sort of consistent now. I think we're in about 8 years of sub 5% annual growth in liabilities over the prior year, which is a figure that we had not seen historically as far as I've ever looked back. So I mentioned at the outset this trend of using more public pension plans using more conservative actuarial methods, and this is one of them. This is the open and closed actuarial, amortization method. A open amortization method, as you probably already know, is would be akin to paying off, refinancing your mortgage every year. And some public pension plans traditionally have done that, where each year they begin, for example, a new 30-year amortization period. And a closed amortization period is akin to a traditional mortgage where you begin, say, at 30 years, and next year it's 29, and then 28, and so on. And we have noticed a notable change in the number of public pension plans that have switched from an open amortization period to a closed one. And a closed amortization period is more conservative, it's more aggressive, it really has the effect of paying down the an unfunded liability more quickly. In fact, an open amortization period can actually result in an amortization period that's much longer than is really advertised. An open amortization period can take far longer than say 30 years to actually amortize that, because you're making progress much more slowly on paying down that unfunded liability. And so one effect of this change in the increased use of closed amortization periods has been predictably a reduction in the average amortization period. So for all of these plans that we monitor, roughly 125 of them, the average amortization period has begun to decline in the last few years. So you go back to the early part of the last decade, particularly in the wake of the very sharp market decline, And you can see that on average, the public pension plans were paying off or projected to pay off their unfunded liabilities over nearly the 30-year period. And that has declined fairly steadily over the last 12 or 15 years now to below 24%. And I suspect that trend will continue as these plans are using a closed, more aggressive amortization period. One factor that's gotten a lot of attention and continues to get an awful lot of attention has been the change in investment return assumptions used by public pension plans. We have witnessed what I'm certain is an unprecedented number and magnitude of change, especially decline in investment return assumptions. Of all the actuarial assumptions that your actuaries use to calculate the condition and cost of the plan, the investment return assumption is outsized. It has a far greater effect on the condition and cost of the plan than any other. And particularly following the Great Recession and the Fed's movement to essentially zero interest rates, public pension plans have been moving to reduce their nominal return assumptions. And you can see back at the beginning of the measurement period, roughly 3/4, maybe more, of the plans in the universe that we monitor were using investment return assumption of 8% and higher. There were some that were north of 8.5% at that time. Really beginning in earnest following the Great Recession, 2009, 2010, we began to see plans begin to use, begin to lower their return assumption, and it's a trend that continues unabated. And literally, I don't think we've gone a month without getting news of a plan reducing its return assumption. Many plans have reduced it more than once. And you know, all else equal, a lower return assumption increases the unfunded liability and also the cost of the plan. So certainly this change is causing a significant headwind for public pension plans' efforts to pay down their unfunded liabilities. On the benefits side, one of the more interesting changes that we've seen, especially over the last 8 or 9 years since the Great Recession, has been changes in cost of living adjustment provisions. And one of the reasons the cost of living adjustment provisions tend to get a lot of attention is that, well, for two reasons. One, a COLA can be a relatively expensive benefit provision. And two, prior to 2010, we're not aware of any state that had actually made a change in its cost of living adjustment that affected existing retirees. And in 2010, that pattern began, in particular in Colorado and South Dakota, that about the same time their legislatures proposed reducing future cost of living adjustments for people who already were retired or are retired. And all of the states that are shown on the map here in the orangish color are states that successfully enacted reductions to future cost of living adjustments for people who already were retired. Again, prior to 2010, we're not aware of an example of a circumstance where that had happened. In many of these states that are colored orange, the legislature was met with a lawsuit, and in most cases, the state's authority to make that change prevailed. In some cases, particularly Oregon and Arizona, the state's effort to reduce the COLA was pared back completely or partially. But in most of the other cases, including, for example, Colorado and South Dakota, which I mentioned, Maine, New Jersey, a handful of other states, there were lawsuits, and ultimately courts agreed with the state's authority to make that change. Again, one of the reasons that this has gotten a lot of attention is because it's relatively new, but also changing a cost of living adjustment can sometimes have a surprisingly large effect on the unfunded liability and the cost of the plan. Another really interesting change that we've seen, and a very consistent change that we've seen over the last 10 years or so, has been the onset of statewide hybrid plans. Excuse me. As you might infer, a hybrid plan is a retirement plan that contains elements of both the defined benefit and defined contribution plan types. And if you go back about, say, 20 years or maybe just a little over 20 years, we have a map that we sometimes show of 1995, and there were exactly 2 states that had statewide hybrid plans on here, Texas and Indiana. And so all of the states that are shown on this map have added these hybrid plans since 1995. Some of these are on an optional basis where the employee may choose to participate in the hybrid plan. In other cases, it's mandatory. but this is clearly a trend. We're seeing about one new hybrid plan added per year. In fact, this chart is actually a little bit outdated because just in the last couple of months, Pennsylvania and Connecticut have also added hybrid plans, and so at least they're, and well, Michigan's already covered on there, so we can add 2 more states to this. And this is an issue that's gotten a lot of legislative attention in recent years as well. Similarly, there has been increased attention to defined contribution plans, the use of defined contribution plans for employees of state and local government. As I mentioned at the outset, still nearly 90% of employees of state and local government today participate in some form of a pension plan. Most of the remainder are in a defined contribution plan. Most of those defined contribution participants actually are employed at a local level among local governments. There's been relatively small participation in defined contribution plans on a statewide basis, but those are shown here. And on the left-hand side under the mandatory column, you can see that for broad employee groups who are hired since the dates indicated, they have only a defined contribution plan. And so most recently, Oklahoma, for example, for state employees. So that's not school teachers or firefighters or police officers, but just state employees hired since that time have only a defined contribution plan. Relative to the hybrid plans, the use of defined contribution plans has been much more muted, but there is a bit of a trend here. And then on the right-hand side, these are optional plans where employees may choose to participate in a defined contribution plan if they wish. And all of those optional plans, with the exception of Colorado, have come about within the last 15 years or so. So just a few final thoughts, if I might, and that is prior to roughly the year 2000 or 2001, the 30, 40-year history of the public pension community was one of improving funding levels and increasing benefits. And really the reverse has taken hold over the last 18 years or so. It's been sort of a completely opposite response. Fortunately, in my view, most states have retained elements of traditional defined benefit plans, mandatory participation, pooled assets, pooled liabilities, benefits that are annuitized, basically the core elements of pension plans or traditional defined benefit plans, even as they've enacted these lower benefit levels and reforms. We've seen a lot of the employment of a lot of more conservative actuarial methods. I think a lot of that has to do with the recognition that maybe these plans were not amortizing their unfunded liabilities as quickly as they had hoped. And when I indicate that those more conservative actuarial assumptions and methods are driving costs higher, that's over the nearer term. That's not necessarily a long-term phenomenon, but those are an effort to pay down unfunded liabilities more quickly. As we looked at, we saw some of these changes in plan designs that are focusing on shifting risk from that traditionally has been borne by employers more to the employees now. And one thing that I really didn't talk about but is worth noting here at the very end, and that is the type and extent of changes that have been made to financing structures and benefit levels and benefit types around the country has varied widely from one state to another due to a number of reasons, including legal protections, the politics of individual states, the condition of the plans, and a wide range of other factors. And I think that ends my prepared remarks, and I'll pass it on to Janine.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I grew up in California, so it's nice to be back. I missed the sun, but you didn't get to see it much today. But at least you don't have the snow and the sleet that I traveled through to get here. I've been in Washington for a while now, and it really has changed. There's been an evolution in kind of what I've been working on. I think we were really trying to kind of remove some of the conflicts between federal laws and state laws, federal, restrictions on what you could pay in a pension and state guarantees on what you promised people you would give them a pension. And we tried to work on fixing those conflicts for a number of years, and it took a long time. But we've really kind of shifted, I think, in recent years to, one, prevent that from happening again, but two, to really, I think the federal government thinks that if they're not writing a regulation, then it must be unregulated. They don't understand that you're primarily regulated at the state level and local level on top of that. And so it really has been a shift to kind of educate Congress on what are the rules in place, what are, and a lot of what I've been doing has been bolstered significantly by the research that our team has done to kind of share what's going on at the state and local level, What are the regulations in place? I know you know that these things are common, but they don't. They don't. If they don't have a rule requiring it, they don't think it exists. So it really is trying to take all of your practices and procedures and try to document them and try to share them with members of Congress, with regulatory agencies, so that they understand what's going on. There's this constant fear that a shoe's going to drop on their watch, and so we do try to make ourselves available. And CalPERS is always very, very responsive. We get questions about California, CalPERS in particular, of helping us get information. I remember once they were shocked that you didn't immediately reduce your return assumption. And they said, well, why? And we brought in like the 3-inch report, the actuarial report on what goes into determining your return assumption. And they were kind of surprised to know that there was such thought put into determining your assumed rate of return. So it is helpful, but you can't assume that they know how you work. They only regulate the private sector pension area, and very few of them are familiar with that. As Keith mentioned, that area is shrinking, so it's mostly a defined contribution world or a union pension world, which I'll mention in a minute. That's kind of conflating issues a little bit. So a lot of what we've done is education, really educating Congress on what's going on around the country and what exists at the state and local level, so that they're not trying to do what's already being done at the state and local levels. And of course, there's been, I would say, more interest in a federal role, or renewed interest in a federal role, but it's not really new. As you look at old reports, the federal government has constantly wondered whether they should be involving themselves in public pensions. It's a constant, ongoing effort to kind of educate them on that. We've also worked a lot with state and local government organizations, National League of Cities, National Governors Association, the Conference of State Legislatures, also all the employee groups, the Firefighters Union, the AFSCME, SEIU, teachers unions. We have a really broad group that we try to keep together, and I think it's not always perfect, but generally on pension issues we tend to work in lockstep, because we feel like these are better regulated at the state level, that the issues are better handled directly, and so we do work hand in hand and try to work together. And the biggest issue of late is, I know, before it was popular to say alternative facts, we were concerned there was all these, trillions and $6 trillion, $15 trillion of unfunded liabilities, and people would just pick numbers out of the air, and it was really coming together around a common set of facts. What are our financial reporting requirements? What is the condition of public pensions, and really coming together. And bonds and state and local finance all got thrown into that together. So we've really made an effort over the last number of years to really get together with all the groups, the stakeholder groups, and come around a common set of facts and try to use those together to relay the financial condition and not paint over it. There are places that really do have troubles, and there are pensions that are in trouble. So trying to be clear about where there are issues, and that they're not systemic, but they do exist. Working more with private sector organizations. We think we know how they work, they think they know how we work, but we came to learn that, wow, there's a lot of big differences between our plans and the plans in the private sector. And there's a lot of things that we have in common that we didn't realize. So we've been working to build understanding, to support each other where we can, or to try to, make sure that people understand there are differences and what those are. And then there's been a lot, I think you've seen this here as well, you have your own homegrown varieties, we have some at the national level, but think tanks and policy organizations and academics have just taken a real keen interest. I sometimes like to blame Keith for building this wonderful database on public pensions, and now everybody wants to research public pensions because of all the great information. But as you'll see, Congress was going to require, or keeps saying that there needs to be more public information. There's a lot of public information on public pensions, and just ask the researchers, it's all out there. And we've taken steps to actually bring that all together. But that's been very important, and it really has kind of pushed back on some efforts that there have been to create a federal reporting requirement on public pensions. We just had tax reform, and there has not been a tax bill that I can remember that didn't have some change to pensions in some way. Mostly in recent years it's been on the private sector side, whether it's the premiums they charge to fund the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, or whether it's the funding requirements that they require of private sector pensions, which they get to write off in taxes, or changes to the limits on how much you can contribute to a pension plan or pay out of them. There hasn't been a bill that's been done that has a tax element that hasn't used pensions to pay for something. And it makes the pension staff on the Hill so frustrated because they work on all these policy things. And once they get scored, somebody else grabs it and uses it, sometimes for a completely unrelated bill, like transportation funding. So we've known that there are all these provisions potentially in play that could come up as far as tax reform. And so what we saw, again, the limits, a new term, ratification, which would be requiring everybody contribute to their pension plan on an after-tax basis. You'd pay taxes now, and then when you'd get a distribution, some of that would be on a tax-free basis. We also saw this idea that, there's too many different types of, defined contribution plans, 401ks, 403bs, 457 plans, and they all have their own special little rules. Let's just merge them all into one plan. Let's normalize them. And, or let's just get rid of the special rules. Let's make them all, even if we leave the tax code sections the same, let's take away some of the things that, in particular, governmental 457 plans have, like not paying a 10% penalty on if you retire early and receive a distribution, special catch-up contributions that 457 plans have. So they were looking at those. Also, changing the tax treatment potentially of the mandatory employee contributions to defined benefit plans. That was hasn't been thrown around recently, but it's always been a concern. It was in a report, a little over 10 years ago. They scored. There was a big revenue raiser back then, and employee contributions have gone up around the country, so that would be a big revenue component if you made all employee contributions be done on an after-tax basis. So the ones that are not bolded and italicized are the ones we knew about. We knew those were going to be potentially in play. And some of them weren't in play. We didn't see them turn up. We didn't see the limits touched. And the ratification I know they really, really wanted to do it, but there was a tweet it was one of the few tweets that I was really excited about, that tweet came out and said, we're not going to do it. And I thought, well, how much is this going to move the needle? But it did. It was just off the table, and supposedly people were really angry about that, but it just got rid of that idea. And so what we really only saw was this idea of eliminating the special rules for 457 plans, getting rid of the 10% penalty, special catch-up contributions, was really one of the main things that got included, but it didn't even make it to the floor of the Senate. It was in one bill, not the other. The two issues that actually made it out of each chamber, one had to do with changing the rules for when the federal government said you can allow people, even if they're still working, if they want to start drawing down their pension. It didn't say you have to allow them to do this, but if you wanted to, you could let them start drawing their pension at age 59 and a half. That would raise a lot of revenue. And that wasn't just for public plans, that was for private plans too. That was in one bill and not the other. And then the other was applying the unrelated business income tax to state and local government pension investments. And that one was a big surprise. So both of those we'd never even heard of before. And those were just kind of put in to these bills as they were moving. And the CalPERS team, I know, is incredibly helpful in reaching out to their delegation. And we had, this year really had been playing, at least at the national association level, had more of a foxhole mentality. I mean, you guys, collectively, state and local government pensions have about $4 trillion. So, drawing a lot of attention to yourself when they're looking to do tax reform was not something we were trying to do. So we were trying to work very below the radar, very behind the scenes, touch base with key committee staff and see what was out there. But again, we were still caught off guard with these two proposals. Then it was, Democrats were not in the room. It was very much of a Republican discussion at that point. There were key people on the tax committees, and then there were key people that were part of the conference agreement. And we all came together, and the states that had those key people, they all, came together. We all worked very closely. We brought in elected officials. We flew folks to Washington to meet with the Speaker's office and others. And we tried to do it again below the radar. We didn't want to draw a lot of media attention to it, but we also brought in private equity folks that would be affected. And even then, I'd never seen it so hard to get something fixed. I mean, this shouldn't have been that hard to do. When they're trying to, increase investment in things like infrastructure, that they would try to apply this to state and local pension investments. It's beyond me. They haven't had any hearings on it, but it was up until the very end that they finally took it out. So I think something we're concerned about is this is potentially coming back. So we need to do a little bit more work amongst ourselves to talk about, where would this affect your portfolio and why. I don't know that the staff really understand how you invest. I think they did the comparison of, well, New York State University owned a spaghetti factory, and that wasn't fair that their spaghetti factory didn't pay taxes and a spaghetti factory down the street did. I don't really think that's a fair comparison to the type of investments that you do. And you're not creating an unfair advantage to your partnerships because you're tax exempt. And those partnerships are not getting an unfair advantage because you're tax exempt. So I think it's about, let's get together, let's ask some questions and put together some good information across systems, especially in those key states, including California for sure, about how this tax really applies to your portfolio. So I think we have some work to do to understand this, because this really kind of hit us by surprise. Additional proposals that we've seen recently, and will they come back again this year? The Public Employee Pension Transparency Act. This has been introduced last 4 Congresses by Congressman Devin Nunes and others. It would impose a whole new regime of reporting requirements. It's been purported to be voluntary. However, if you fail to do it correctly, your participating plan sponsors would no longer be able to issue federally tax-exempt bonds. So not really voluntary. We thought this was really a shot across the bow before the Government Accounting Standards Board made its changes to how pensions are accounted for. And we really had hoped it would go away once GASB finalized its rules. And it did really, I think a lot of the wind went out of the sails, but he did still introduce it last Congress. He has not yet reintroduced it this Congress. We really hope it won't come back, but every time I say that, it comes back again. So hopefully this has been put to rest, but I can't promise that they don't still feel that they want to have a federal risk-free disclosure and a federal database, even though, as I've mentioned, we have a database that we've created across public plans. So most offices aren't really excited about this, but there are a few that are. And especially on the tax committee, there's one tax staffer in particular, I think he was behind that UBIT proposal. He likes this a lot, so it still could be out there. The Secure Annuities for Employee Retirement Act. This is a bill that had a lot of things in it, but Title I had a specific proposal that would, it was, again, voluntary, at least that's how it was drafted originally, that states could offer up, instead of a DB plan, they could purchase this kind of yearly annuity to replace it from a private insurance company. And there's nothing, most folks believe that there's nothing preventing state and local governments from doing this now. It would just be a very expensive way to provide a benefit. But this would put a whole, slew of requirements on how you do it. So it seems to make it more complicated to do what they're saying. And also, it replaces, you couldn't do it and still have your DB plan. So, what are the chances of this returning? This was sponsored and by no one else. The chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Orrin Hatch, and his staffer that he had, Preston Rutledge, was the mastermind behind it. He really believed in it. He, I think, maybe backed off of it a little bit, but it never had any other sponsors. And we also saw a bill come out that was from the Senate Finance Committee. It was unanimously supported last Congress, passed out. They really hoped to move it, and it had everything else in the bill except for that annuity proposal. So we really think maybe they walked away from that a little bit. On top of that, Chairman Hatch has announced his retirement, so I'm not sure how much he will work on pension issues. I really do think the Retirement Enhancement Security Act that he did in a bipartisan fashion would be where he would start, not going to something that is more partisan. And also, Preston Rutledge is the staffer that really was the mastermind behind it. He's now been confirmed as the Assistant Secretary of Labor for the Employee Benefit Security Administration. So, and Labor does not have jurisdiction over state and local pensions, so he will not be doing any work directly on state and local pensions. Where he may do work, and for those of you who are interested in this issue, is secure choice plans. Department of Labor, has done ruling in the past on that. They will be working on the ERISA components of that, so he could be involved in that proposal. and regulatory efforts in that area. I mentioned earlier there's been a little confusion about state and local pensions and pensions in other sectors. In particular, we were hearing for the longest time, especially after the Great Recession, that there were public sector, state pensions asking for a federal bailout. And to my knowledge, no state pension plan was asking for a federal, bailout. So it was very difficult to, we kept hearing it crop up. Well, I think there was some confusion. There's a Teamsters plan called Central States Pension Fund. And as silly as it sounds, I honestly think that some people thought that was a state pension plan. So, and it still comes up. And so we try to clarify that that is not a state pension plan. It is a Teamster plan. But they are still, and we expect something in the next couple of weeks, they are still looking at ways to address the funding issues that are in some of the biggest multi-employer pension plans. And there's a loan proposal that's underway. There's also, kind of with that, there's an idea of having something called a composite plan, which would make their benefit plans going forward more adjustable, more of a variable type plan, so it wouldn't be a pure defined benefit. It would be kind of a hybrid-ish type plan. It looks a little bit like the type of plan that maybe Wisconsin or South Dakota has, which is a little more adjustable. So that is something that's getting more attention. The mine workers also, there's a discussion about a loan for mine worker pensions, and there hasn't been one time that somebody suggests a loan or something for the private sector pensions that some of the think tanks don't write a piece on no bailouts, and they always mention public sector pensions will be next. So we do have work to do when they're working on these, and we've also had, I think, friendly offices say, well, while we're at it, is there anything you guys want? And we've been trying to be pretty clear that we think, any federal loans or strings would not be advantageous. And so I can't say that every public official from around the country is on the same page, but most of them are. And there has been attempts to get the Conference of State Legislatures to adopt something. And quickly there was pushback from the committee saying, we don't really want to go down that path. We think states should take care of their problems themselves and not involve the federal government. So that's been a pretty consistent message, but we are hearing that there are, in Illinois in particular, that the governor may want to come up with a proposal to have the federal government help with giving them access to the bankruptcy courts. So there's a lot of discussion underway, and we think that we'll need to be able to respond if there is discussion, again, from some people who are trying to help and other people who are trying to really ratchet down benefits or get rid of public pensions. It's interesting, all the different groups that come together around these things. And then I think there's been confusion in our own sector about the changes that Congress enacted on the union plans. I think you may have seen some of the press reports about, them petitioning the Treasury Department to be able to cut benefits in order to keep their plan solvent. That was a bill that was passed, and that does apply to those plans, but that does not apply to state and local pension plans. It's a whole different structure. So I think people on the Hill get a little confused. I think even people at home, there's been some beneficiaries. I don't know if you've gotten questions from your own, but does this apply? Could you petition the federal government to cut your benefits? And that does not cover public plans. The market regulators have been watching pensions more and more. The SEC, the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, and there's even a new office in the Treasury Department that just is looking at how do state and local governments' obligations to their pensions maybe affect their financial viability. SEC in particular is interested in how they affect their ability to issue bonds. Are they being very clear when they issue a bond with the other obligations that they have? And so there's been some fraud cases brought about some states not maybe properly reporting the condition of their pension plan when they go to issue a bond. So a lot more attention being paid to properly disclosing the financial condition of your pension if you're going to go to the market with a bond. And a lot of activity in that area in recent years. A lot of groups came together to kind of come up with adequate disclosures, or just making that aware that you can't just cut and paste what you put in from last year. You've got to be very clear in your bond disclosures and your official statements about the financial condition of your pension plan. I'd like to say, renewed efforts on intergovernmental relations. Many years ago, there used to be the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. That was disbanded, I think, in 1995. And this year, we saw, or last year, the speaker and the Democratic leader announced the task force on intergovernmental affairs, and they brought a lot of the groups together to really talk about, federal, pushing back on federal overreach, but we didn't see a lot of state and local governments really at the table when they pushed through tax reform. And as you know, a lot of changes were made to deductibility of state and local taxes and pension bonds, state and local government bonds. I think we were happy that this group was formed, but in the end, I'm not sure how much they were listening to state and local governments when they were pushing through things at the federal level. But we've been pretty united. I mentioned we work with quite a few groups. When there's been efforts to impose federal reporting requirements or to suggest a federal role, Governors Association, firefighters, others, we've all come together and pretty much been in lockstep to oppose federal intervention. We've tried to make it clear there really hasn't been any suggestion for federal involvement that's been helpful. I mean, it doesn't lower costs, doesn't protect your benefits, doesn't improve your financing, and public pension issues are not systemic. As Keith mentioned, fiscal and legal frameworks, are different all the way around the country. There's no one solution that's going to work for everybody. It has to be done in a tailored approach at the state and local level. So really, even if the federal government wanted to do something helpful, there really isn't one thing that they can do that would work for everybody. State and local governments haven't really been sitting on their hands. Everybody's been looking to make changes, the ones that Keith discussed, bringing more conservative actuarial assumptions, changes going forward. The GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board, issued brand new reporting requirements that had long been in the works, but those became final. Our information is public, and we have created an online database. So some of the things that they were looking to do, they're not really necessary. We've tried to get out a lot more information with our counterparts at the state and local levels, the national groups, on public information and disclosures. And then we've tried to put out issue briefs in different little areas that are topical about reforms and disclosure, databases, and other things. But we're always happy to hear if there's something we're missing or a data compilation. I always give Keith lots of work. So I ask people for input and I hand it off to him. But his work has really, really been helpful in me being able to relay to the people at the national level the condition of us as a community.
Right. Thank you, Janine, and thank you, Keith. Madam President, I will turn to the board and the executive team for any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Ms. Hollinger.
Yes, thank you. Great presentation. Really appreciate it. This question is to Keith. I was curious on the COLA from a risk perspective. And I was curious how maybe certain people addressed it. One of the things I worry about is if we go below a certain funding level, like let's say 60%, is there ever language then that you could freeze it just from a risk perspective? Because if we hit a high inflationary period, it could, put us below 50 and then it's non-recoverable as more a stopgap from a risk perspective.
So you're not addressing the legality of the issue. It's really a funding issue that you're raising, or an actual.
Yeah, that it wouldn't spiral us if we hit below a certain funding level and had a high inflationary period, that it could put us below 50%.
Well, the COLA is one element of the plan design. It's part of the overall benefit structure. If I'm not mistaken, your COLA is capped?
I don't know that, is it capped?
There's a limit.
It's capped with banking.
But-
It's capped with banking.
No, we do have the triple PA, which means we get up, they get up to around 2% COLA per year, but then we get at least 80, for the public agencies, 80% of inflation. So you don't lose more than 80% or 20%, and then it would your COLA would actually match inflation at some point.
So yeah, under that circumstance, if inflation were to spike,
Right, if inflation spiked and we hit below a funding level, are there any, do you ever see language that trigger that? That
Well,
would be my concern from a risk perspective.
There is a remarkable range of COLA plan designs. I mean, there's almost one for every state. You would be surprised at the different ways one can design a COLA. But all else equal, a spike in inflation that drives your COLAs up is going to have an actuarial impact on the plan. If that is in excess of what the actuaries are assuming is going to happen.
Any other questions? I guess I have a question about language. We often use this word pension reform, and to me, reform implies that the change is for the positive, that it's correcting something that is wrong. And I really think we need to change the language that we use around this, and I'm curious if you've done any thinking around that.
Yeah, we have. We have documented and written extensively on the issue of pension reform, and I'm very sensitive to the issue that you just raised. We use the word reform literally as a change, a reform of the plan design. But when we use the word reform, it's not intended to imply that it's better or worse. It's only different. It's reformed.
We
Well, I
do try to
understand
use
that might be the
modification or changes or,
Yeah.
we try to use a lot of other, because it is a sensitive.
It's sort of a hot button term, and I guess I see so often the opponents to public pensions are very creative in the way they use language, and they're able to generate support as a result of that. And I just think we, perhaps as a group, collectively, we could be a little smarter in how we use language. Also,
I appreciate the suggestion, and we'll keep that in mind.
Thank you. Any further questions? Well, seeing none, really, thank you so much for a very instructive panel.
Thank you.
Well, this concludes our meeting for the day. We've had some outstanding and truly substantive discussions, and we've learned a lot from our teams as well as from our visiting experts. I know it takes a great deal of preparation, so thank you so much to all who are with us today. So one last round of applause for all of our presenters today. And thanks again to all those in attendance. For our audience, we'll begin tomorrow's session at 9 a.m. back in this room. The board will receive fiduciary training as part of our ongoing effort to understand all facets of our responsibilities to members and stakeholders. For members of the board and our executive team, please be sure to fill out our survey. I don't think everyone has quite done that yet. You still have another day to do that, or a couple days. And then join us for our team building activity at 5:30 in the lobby. Thanks, everyone.